Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. On behalf of my group, I'd like to introduce the Growers First business-to-business team. My name is Stacy Rosen. This is Stephanie Thompson. On this side, we have Heather Barnes and Jared Eisenberg. So just so you don't get lost, I'm going to tell you our agenda for today. We'll start by talking about our market assessment, followed by research justification, interview findings, survey data analysis, our so what recommendations, the operations timeline, suggested research, and finally the conclusion.
So we started out, we looked at the big picture, we looked at a national overview, and as you can see, of course, United States recovering from economic recession, Q4 2008, and we're looking at now in Q4 2010, 2.8% growth. We saw GDP in 2010 to be 14.660 trillion, and 21.9% of that dedicated to agriculture. So we looked more specifically, after we looked nationally, we looked at the local assessment. We saw urban infrastructure, DC of course, very applicable. It's great to have urban infrastructure, trucking and rail systems, great distribution channels. We also looked at commuters and students. On average, per day, 500,000 commuters come into DC to work who are not DC residents. And 9 months of the year, there are 10 universities that bring an additional 65,000 students to the DC area. So there's a lot of traffic. We also looked at a gentrified consumer base. We saw that on average, the average income is $91,500, which is obviously higher than you'd expect, with only a 3.8% unemployment rate, which is terrific because Growers First, of course, does offer a higher price point. And finally, recession-proof real estate. Well, what do we mean here? A subprime mortgage crisis hit the real estate market in the United States across the board, but somehow in DC, the real estate remained relatively stable and prices actually appreciated in value.
Okay, so then we took a look at the industry overview. So within the coffee market, we noticed that there was torrential downpours all throughout Central America, as well as inclement weather patterns in Africa. Now, at first, this seems like it might be a bad thing for coffee, and yes, coffee prices across the board rose. But what's good for organic coffee companies is that it decreased the price gap between the two. So this now makes it easier for consumers to be able to justify spending just a little bit more to purchase organic coffee. So our competitive assessment. Consumers are actually one of our competitors. Sometimes it's easier and cheaper just to make your own coffee at home instant. And so it's a little hard to reach these people if they're set in their own ways and they don't want to go out and purchase coffee. Retailers, more like vendors and restaurants, we're going to get into the examples that we went out and interviewed. Specialty grocers like Foggy Bottom Grocery, and online. So if you purchase your coffee online, sometimes if you purchase from the same website, from the same company, you're already stuck in your ways, and why would you switch if you're already satisfied? So there's no incentive. So we did a SWOT analysis of Growers First. And as most of you know, one of the biggest strengths is the traceable transformation. The idea that you can just pick up a bag of coffee, scan the barcode, or look online, and you know where your coffee came from, who made your coffee, and so that's a great thing that we want to market all across the board. One of the weaknesses is a lack of coffee program. Stephanie is going to get into that later, but it's basically the idea that we need to offer up more of a service as opposed to just a product. Opportunities, niche market, because Growers First is definitely differentiated. It's the idea behind it, it's easy to be able to market it, and based on our interviews with both consumers and the retailers, people seem to be excited by the product and they actually want to buy it. So some of our threats, Ethical Bean is a company that is pretty much the same as Growers First, but it's not exactly there. But they're close enough that sometimes people might choose one over the other, and they're going to be one of our main competitors. Java City, on the other hand, will be one of our competitors in the sense that they have a coffee program and they sell to local cafes, which we'll also talk about, but they have a program that we need to set up, so that's kind of a threat for us.
Okay, so we went out and analyzed the DC market to choose a few different companies and retailers to see the wide spectrum of the DC market. So the first one we chose was Corner Bakery Cafe, which represents the retailers that are national, that are chains like Panera Bread and Au Bon Pain. So we did an in-depth interview with them, also with Soho Tea and Coffee, which is in DuPont Circle, which is an individual coffee shop, which is very unique, and it has its own creation of coffees. So you have that clientele that comes specifically for the special coffees. Another one was Fobo Grow, which is similar to Soho Tea and Coffee because it's one that is just in our area. And lastly, the Fairmont Hotel, which represents the high-end retailers, which we saw as another potential client for Growers First. We also created a survey, which was sent out to other retailers in the DC area that we couldn't get in-depth interviews with, but we sent it to Corner Bakery Cafe as well, Au Bon Pod, Fobo Grow, Dean and DeLuca, which is another specialty store and grocery, and as well the Four Seasons. Oh, and okay, so now I'm going to talk about the first in-depth interview we did, which was with Corner Bakery Cafe, which, like I mentioned, is a national chain. So it was started in Chicago, it was a supplier to Maggiano's Italian restaurant, and from there was a popular demand for their goods. So they opened up a shop and ended up expanding over the next few years, and now they're a national chain. So when we did the in-depth interview with two of the managers at two different locations in DC, we found that this actually surprised us the most. The most thing that they valued was the coffee programs, aside from price and quality of the coffee. And a coffee program is basically that Java City is their supplier, and they sell not only the coffee grind and the beans, but also a system of filters, syrups, machine cleaning, maintenance, and they come quarterly to check on the quality of the coffee to make sure that it's standardized across the country. So this one actually surprised us, and we found that unless Growers First could provide something like a coffee program, they really wouldn't have a place, wouldn't see it as a potential client. Soho Tea and Coffee, like I mentioned, was an individual cafe. Now this place was very focused on atmosphere. It has a very Greenwich Village, New York City feel, and a lot of the customers have been coming since the beginning when it opened. They provide very unique coffees, and after talking to the manager, who is a very interesting character, let's just say he's kind of hippie-ish, and but anyway, he told us that the most important factor was price and quality. And when it came down to it, that yes, environmentally conscious companies were important, but if they could meet that competitive price, they wouldn't be interested in buying a product like that. He also mentioned that the coffee shops and programs that really succeed are the ones that have been around for the longest, the ones that have people who've been working in the industry for the longest and have the experience with the product.
Okay, so then we sat down with the owner of Fobo Grow to interview him, and we found immediately that there was definitely a place for Growers First on the shelves of Foggy Bottom groceries, so we wanted to get really into it and see what it would take to get this product on their shelves. And basically what they said was price was an issue, but the main thing was that if they were going to carry the product on their shelves, they wanted a signed agreement that they would be the exclusive carriers of this product for at least 4 to 5 months, and this contract would include other retailers such as Fobo Grow, but would exclude higher-end hotels because that's not really their competitor. And during this time period, they would feature the product as a specialty item and kind of give it that spotlight. But they definitely wanted to secure the first mover advantage to make sure that the product would be successful in their location. And lastly, we spoke to the food and beverage director at the Fairmont Hotel, and the main point that he brought up was that they only carry products that their customers know the name of. For example, right now they provide Illy coffee, and he said that all his customers know the name and they know the quality that's associated with that brand. So until Growers First could establish that brand recognition, they weren't going to consider carrying the product.
So we continued our primary data search, and we used a survey because obviously we only had interviews with 4 participants. We needed to get a more representative sample. And in this survey we only had 5 questions, the reason being that it was kind of hard to get high response rates, as I guess many of you would expect and maybe have experienced in your projects. So the first question we asked was, as you can see here, of the following factors, which is most influential when you choose a coffee product? And we found that, as you'd expect, brand recognition or reputation based on quality and price being the 2 most important. Now, you can see as well that there is some interest in origins, and yes, organically certified and farming practices as well, maybe not so much soil type, but at the same time, there's definitely a concern that price and quality really remain high. So despite the the origin and the means of growing the product, there's definitely something to look at there on the price competitive side. The second question we asked was, do you sell coffee that supports fair trade or Rainforest Alliance programs? The results were interesting as well. We found that 29 of our 47 respondents said yes to either program. Now that's interesting because not only does that represent the majority, but also we assumed that maybe there was some error in the responses, thinking that maybe they were familiar with the program instead of implementing it, but one way or the other they were still conscious of the fact that the market exists. The follow-up question we had was, if you selected yes in question 2, please explain why. Now this is great because we had one of our respondents embed a YouTube video in SurveyMonkey. They posted the link, and you'll find out who the respondent was pretty quickly if you take a look at it. There's no sound. So yes, it was McDonald's probably who gave us that information. But one way or the other, this was their justification as to why they use Rainforest Alliance. I guess they were talking about the value proposition in doing so. And then the fourth question, what percentage estimate of annual coffee spends is for coffee? This was actually a question that came directly from the management team, from Eric specifically. And we found that the responses here were also very interesting, in that while coffee had the majority percentage estimated around 25% of the coffee expenditure, you can see that there's not much variation between the other items they purchase. So for example, you have between 10 and 25% of all coffee products. Other supplies, cups, filters, machine services, and tea as well, if for those who are interested in tea. So even though coffee is the product, we're talking about the tools necessary to sell the product and to implement it on a local level, and there's a lot of expenditure there as well. And the fifth question we ask, in your opinion, what do your customers value the most in coffee purchases? This was an interesting question because, of course, we didn't ask the customers directly, but instead asked their sellers, their vendors, to estimate what their choice would be. And we saw here a consistent response that 12 of the 47 respondents said quality, 11 said price, and I guess a close third would be 9 brand, building into I guess, quality again. But we did not see an option listed was sustainability, whether the coffee is sustainable, whether it's sustainably grown, and not one vendor selected that as a primary choice for their consumer. So whether the consumer actually believes it to be true is beyond our reach, but we saw that I guess the vendor did not think that to be an important component when the consumer makes a decision.
So our recommendation for Growers First consists of a coffee. Well, the first thing that we've noticed is to really expand. We believe that a coffee program should be implemented in Growers First. Now this we discussed and thought of the idea of partnering with someone in the DC area who could provide the program while Growers First provided the coffee. This would really increase brand recognition in the DC area among vendors. And from there, with the profits from that, we thought that also implementing a sustainable supply chain could also really go hand in hand with what Growers First stands for. So to get in more detail of that, we used Max Hamburger, the Swedish case study, as an example or as a model to base it off of. And to start off with really the small changes. That's what Max Hamburger tried to really state in their analysis that we read. And that starts off with just transportation, like carbon, the vehicles that are the electric vehicles, and using that stuff for transporting domestically, but even like carbon labeling on the packaging. Just small changes, even writing on it like how Max did the carbon emission per item that you choose. Same thing with the coffee. To go even further, if it was implemented in a coffee program, we could, Growers First could create a system of using reusable jars and cans and glasses to provide to their vendor. So instead of wasting all of creating waste through the packaging, they could just simply give back the jars to Growers First to refill the coffee and then bring it back. And we believe that this would really help them get a hold in the DC market. Another idea that we came up with was a local vendor approach, which is we got from the talking with Fobo Grow. And Growers First had mentioned that they really wanted to make an impact on the college campus, make college students aware of what they stood for. So we thought that Fobo Grow was the best way for them to get in touch with the GW community. But this is also something that can be replicated at other universities in the country. If you have a local like specialty store, coffee shop, or even grocery store, they can go there, sell their product. If you have students aware of it, you're sure to spread, you know, the brand name throughout. And from there, we believe that if it becomes something that's really known in the Foggy Bottom area, it'll eventually expand to other parts of DC. And from there, we thought that places like the Fairmont Hotel would suddenly become aware of it, and it could use it for seasons. And if that brand, it really depends on the brand recognition that's gained in DC.
And so this is an estimated timeline of events for implementing the practices that we've suggested. And as you can see, we'll look at the coffee program first. So in year one, it's very important to get this established, as everything else kind of is based on the success of this. You'll see in year two, it's still important to keep developing the coffee program, but a little bit less than in year one. And year three in the future, it's still something that you'll have to fine-tune every now and then, but clearly not a focus of their attention. Next, we'll look at securing Fobo Grow. And as you can see, that's only in year one. We think it's really important that Growers First gets their products into Foggy Bottom to start their building their brand recognition in the area. So that really needs to happen in year one. Next, we'll look at marketing and promotion. It's a small portion of year one, and that will predominantly be focused with Fobo Grow and kind of getting the product, people to know about that it's there and the benefits of it. In year two, you see a little bit more attention to marketing and promotion. Year three and the future, it will continue to grow, like as you can see on the graph. And finally, the green supply chain. We see that this is important in year two to start focusing on this. But again, you'll need the increased capital that you'll get from the successes with Fobo Grow and the partnership from year one to implement the changes to make this green supply chain. You see the same attention to that in year three, and again, in the future, it will kind of taper off as old practices are replaced with sustainable ones.
Okay, so obviously, I think all of us experience the same thing, but with limited time and resources, it's hard to conduct a complete research project and just hand it over to a company and expect it to be completed. And so we would like to give Growers First some additional research we think they should follow up on. Focus groups, as we mentioned, I mean, we interviewed and we surveyed a lot of local retailers and vendors, but we think possibly going back and talking to the hotels after our brand recognition is built up within the first year would be something that they definitely expressed they were interested in sort of supplying our coffee, and so talking to them would be great. Consumers, we only did it in the DC area, and again, we only reached a limited amount of people. If Growers First decides to take this plan nationwide, obviously it will be important to do more focus groups with consumers all across the nation. And retail vendors, again, we did the research now, and so when this plan actually comes into action, things might have changed. Retailers might not be able to supply the coffee at that point, so it's important to do follow-up research. And so local market and trend research, same thing. This type of thing changes all the time. So while we did the research now, it might not be as valid in the future when Growers First decides to come into DC. So this is something that never really stops. It's the kind of research you just need to do all the time throughout the 4-year plan that we had proposed. And so in conclusion, we talked a little bit about brand recognition being a very important aspect for vendors to want to sell our coffee to consumers. So as long as we can sort of increase that within this area, we think it'll be easier to move into different sectors. Price and quality, as we mentioned, very important to both consumers and to the vendors. While our quality is there, we do need to learn to be a little bit more flexible maybe with price. Foggy Bottom Grocery cannot necessarily afford the same price point that the Four Seasons Hotel can. But we do think that by going into Foggy Bottom Grocery at a lower price point, it might be able to fund us and get that brand recognition so that we can then sell it at a higher price point to the Four Seasons and sort of make the money back up that way. And the coffee program that we mentioned is definitely one of our key points. Being able to provide an entire coffee program gives us a great competitive edge. Not very many people do that, but as we mentioned, there are some out there, and like the Corner Bakery Cafe will not accept our coffee until we can bring them a valid coffee program and a system that we can work with them. And so on behalf of the Business to Business Growers First Group, we'd like to thank you for your time and open the floor for questions.